introduce Dr. Starr and this distinguished panel and wish them well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, we have a very simple format. We have a very distinguished panel. We will ask each panel member, after I introduce him or her, to say in 2 or 3 very simple declarative sentences what they've learned from the energy crisis. We will then go on to another panel member and have the same exercise. Then we will go back to our panel members and allow them to elaborate on what they've learned, and then we'll go to questions and answers. So I think that makes for a format that will give us a lively discussion, not dominated by any one member. Our first speaker is the Honorable Deborah Bowen, who is State Senator representing the 28th District in Redondo Beach. She's a Democrat. She has served in the State Assembly from 1992 to 1998 and was elected to the Senate in 1998. As the chair of the Senate Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Communications, she has been a key player in developing both immediate and long-term solutions for the energy crisis. Senator, what 2 major lessons have you learned from the energy crisis?
I think the most important lesson is that effective, workably competitive markets don't just happen. It is, in fact, harder to run a fair and competitive market than it is to regulate. The second is that you can't run a market if the only action is on the supply side and there's no effective market on the customer side of the meter, on the demand side of the meter.
Well, I think, Senator, you've almost summarized the entire energy crisis, but we'll go on to Professor Charles Cicchetti, who holds the Miller Chair in Government, Business, and the Economy at the University of Southern California and was formerly the Deputy Director of the Energy and Environment Policy Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Nationally known as a business consultant, his books include Restructuring Electricity Markets, A World Perspective. Professor Cicchetti.
The first lesson I learned is that you can put wings on a train, but it's not going to fly. And the fact is that if you try to regulate markets, as we have done and continue to do in California, we're probably going to guarantee that, as we saw in the beginning, we had wholesale prices that were high and we froze retail prices. And now we've frozen retail prices high and we have low wholesale prices. Those are real challenges that tell me that California has to choose between a regulated state and a market state. I prefer markets. I'm a conservative Republican. I think that markets are capable of outperforming regulation in most things, including a commodity called electricity. In fact, something that I believe that very few people are realizing in California is that if you answer the following question, what's 25, 25, 150, 25, 25, and yet the answer to that question is it's 250, and if you divide 250 by 5, you get 50. And 50 is the price that we paid for electricity under cost of service regulation. And 25, 25, 150, 25, 25 are the prices in the wholesale market that California's experienced. Everybody is focusing on the dilemma of what to do about the year in which prices went to 150. We're not focusing that prices today are back at 25, and they're likely to stay that way or even go lower in 2002. So markets work. Politically, we don't seem to be able to deal with the challenge of what to do when, in fact, wholesale prices or commodity prices shoot up for a commodity that we're used to seeing be provided to us as an essential service, and for one that we don't really want to think about the price varying to the extent that it did in 2000, 2001.
Professor, we'll have an opportunity to come back. If those are 2 sentences, there's a lot of semicolons in those sentences. We'll come back to you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Jess Dasovich is the Senior Director for Policy at the Enron Corporation. Previously, he was a managing consultant with the Law and Economics Consulting Group and has served with the Public Utilities Commission's Strategic Planning Division, where he worked on telecommunication and electricity deregulation. He He's been with Enron since 1997. Mr. Dasovich.
Thank you. I liked Senator Bowen's description in 2 sentences. I'll add a little bit to that. I also agree with much of what Professor Cicchetti said. I think the first thing that being a Californian and having had the opportunity to live under the good old days of a nuclear power plant every 50 miles on the coast when we had intrusive regulation, or benevolent regulation, I guess they called it back then, and then this plan that California engaged in a few years ago. I guess the 2 lessons that I would take from that are, one, deregulation didn't fail in California because California never deregulated. California essentially re-regulated a failed regulated structure, in fact created a couple more monopolies to boot. The second lesson that I would take from California is that turning back the clock, trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube, the genie back in the bottle, whatever metaphor you want to use, will fail in the same way that regulation of the past failed, which is why we embarked on trying to change things and try to bring the electric industry up to speed where every other commodity industry is. So I think we've got to get it right this time, much in the way that Senator Bowen described, and going back isn't going to do it for us.
Thank you. John Fielder is the Senior Vice President for Regulatory Policy with Southern California Edison. His current duties include directing SCE's Environmental Affairs Division and managing SCE's proceedings and relations with the Public Utilities Commission and other regulatory agencies. What 2 lessons, Mr. Fielder, have you learned?
Thank you, Kevin. I've kind of been with this company for 32 years and doing what I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 since this deregulation started, and so I think I can speak to at least some lessons that we've learned out of the hundreds we could pick. The 2 that I would think rise to the top in my mind are, number 1, electricity is not just another commodity like pork bellies or soybeans, and when we start tinkering with the laws and the regulations and the markets that govern the supply, distribution, and consumption of electricity, we need to be very, very careful because it's a fragile infrastructure, it is a fragile industry, and when you start moving one part, you're not sure what's going to move in another place. Secondly, and this seems like common sense now, but a few years ago we made this mistake, is we should be very wary when retail rates or retail prices disconnect from wholesale prices. Because when the retail segment of a market doesn't see the wholesale price signals, the market will not work. And we made that mistake in California, and other places are making the same mistake. So those are the 2 that I would say, Kevin, are on the top of my list.
Joseph Pratt is the Cullen Professor of History and Business at the University of Houston. He's nationally known as an expert on the energy industry and public policy. Among his many books are The Rise of the Corporate Commonwealth. Professor Pratt, what 2 lessons have you learned?
I want to tie my first one to John's comment. I think I have learned, it's been reinforced, electricity is not a normal commodity. It's not just another commodity like shoes. And as we go forward, if we are intent on going forward toward more market-driven solutions in electricity, we need to think harder about why it's different. And I would start with at least 2 things. First, it's vital to the smooth function of the modern economy. So if the market fails, it's not just an industry, it's the whole economy. And second, there's a very important, and we've kind of neglected it today, a very important national security component to electricity and energy in general that we should be very aware of in this day and time. And the easier second lesson as a historian, this is a long-term process we've embarked on to deregulate. It's going to be 20 to 25 years before we know whether we've done it well or not. It's to build a new system.
Well, that takes care of all our, no, we have,
We got Steve.
Except for me.
oh,
Steve Weissman.
excuse me, Steve, sorry. 2 people, Steve Larson and Weisman.
That's fine, yeah.
Yes. Mr. Steve Larson is currently the Executive Director of the California Energy Commission. Previously was the longtime staff director of the Senate Budget Committee. As a staffer with Senator Al Alquist in the 1970s, he helped draft the laws creating the Energy Commission.
Thank you. I'm a pragmatist, and I'm in search of solutions. And as an administrator within the government, I want to know what it's going to look like. What's going to be the role of the state government in the new way in which we look at energy, and particularly electricity in California. I think at the moment we need to stay focused on the issues. We need to be able to look at the multitude of different issues that are out there and stay focused on how to solve them, how to come to grips with them. And perhaps the key issue among those that I'm interested in looking at and think comes out of the current situation is market monitoring. There's no way in which the state at the moment has a way in which it can look carefully and in some consistent way and monitor what's happening in the marketplace. And to me, in the future, that's going to be the most important effort.
Stephen Weissman is the senior energy consultant with the California Public Utilities Commission. He has been directly involved with the Public Utilities Commission decisions throughout the entire deregulation effort. Mr. Weissman, what two things have you learned from this crisis?
Well, not to go last on this panel, I think probably be the first one. I'm sitting up here looking at these 6 other incredible experts in this field and wondering what's going to be left. Well, when you get to me, there's plenty left, as a matter of fact, because this is a relatively complex problem that we're dealing with. So the two I'm going to select for further discussion potentially. First is the issue of accountability. In order to have the delivery of this particular precious commodity work effectively, there has to be a clear sense of who's accountable for what aspect of what's being provided, and I'll try to explain that a little later. And the other thing is, if you're going to embark on the kind of 20 or 25-year experiment that we're talking about, one that affects the lives of everybody in the state as profoundly as this one does, I think one better have a very clear sense of why they're doing it. And I think we need to talk about that a little bit more too.
Well, thank you very much. I have the option as chair to move throughout this, the various responses in singular and in groups, and I'd like perhaps some of you to respond. A number of you have said in one way or another that electricity is not just another commodity. You need to be careful. So I'd like to open that up as the first topic. Everyone who wants to take that up, who presented it, or someone else who wants to. What is the special nature of this commodity?
If this was third on my list, and I figured everyone else would say it, and in fact they did, but when we look at how we use various commodities, whether there is an adequate substitute, we see pretty clearly that there isn't a very good substitute for electricity in many kinds of applications. You can't run a hospital and all the many kinds of things that happen in healthcare on anything but electricity. Our water purification runs on it, manufacturing, education, a whole host of communications applications, and it can't be stored. It has to be delivered in real time. So it is far more subject to price manipulation and withholding and other behavior that is designed not to benefit the common good but the purveyors of the commodity. And it means that that control over the market and the escape mechanisms are even more important, but it is the starting point for this whole discussion.
Could that be that electricity doesn't respond to classic markets? Professor Cicchetti, you were mentioning comments to that effect.
I actually disagree with anybody who thinks that electricity is anything but a commodity. The only thing about electricity is the political nature of electricity as I see it. And the political nature is that we're not used to prices varying for electricity the way it does for other things that we buy and depend upon. In fact, in the year of 2000, 2001, when we had the serious price fly-up in the Western California, we had the worst combination of weather, a very unique weather combination that alone caused and would have caused any commodity price to rise. The failure was we weren't able to politically accept and respond to that. And we prevented that price signal from going to retail consumers until months into the crisis. And by then, we had 2 bankrupt or near bankrupt utilities, and the state had to come in and buy the power in order to keep the lights on. That was the crisis. It was a political crisis, because electricity really is a commodity. There's nothing about electricity that makes it so different than oil, natural gas, even corn syrup that we rely on for almost all the food and beverages that we drink in the United States. We certainly have to eat and drink. We don't believe that we have to put controls over the corn syrup or corn futures markets. We have those things, and we're used to dealing with them by having people contract around it. So I think electricity is a commodity, and it's a mistake to think of it as something that is a requirement for the government to provide to us and guarantee us a price.
Can I take one?
Mr. Wiseman first, because I have a suspicion that he's disagreed, and then we'll go on to Mr. Tasevich, please.
Is this just another commodity? I was trying to just quickly jot down trying to find a couple other examples of things that are out in the marketplace, but if they fluctuated the way energy prices have been fluctuating, how would we deal with our lives? What about if rent fluctuated the way energy prices have? Could people afford to suddenly pay 20 or 30 times more in their rent for next month than they did in the last month? What about milk? How about water? And how about having an arrangement under which every single stitch of clothing that you own is going to be available to you only if you pay the market price in a given month, or don't pay the market price? You know, if it shoots up 20 or 30 times, I think we're going to have to hope for warmer days.
Mr. Tasevich.
Yeah, I think what Steve just mentioned is a very, very good manifestation of California's botched experiment, and that California, in fact, didn't deregulate at all. And I think that's where the confusion comes in, because, in fact, electricity is a commodity like anything else. The real big difference is it can't be stored. But let me just give a couple of examples. Home heating oil, for anybody my mother's from New England, and I don't know if anybody's been to New England, but home heating oil is a real necessity, and your life can depend on it. The competition for home heating oil in New England is intense. It is a commodity. There are stickers on the subway in Boston that you can pull off where people compete for that. When Steve talks about price volatility, all commodities are volatile. But you and I, generally speaking, at the retail level, are immune from that volatility because people do things like you buy a fixed price contract. And let me just very briefly, in 30 seconds, tell you where California got it so upside down, and this is one of the major reasons California got in the mess it did. California's deregulation had nothing to do with markets. What California did effectively was it created this thing called the power exchange, which doesn't exist anywhere else. You have spot markets, but this wasn't a spot market. And then what it said was everybody has to buy and sell from that spot market. It was equivalent to the state of California saying every single homeowner in this state has to be on a variable rate mortgage. Well, you know what? That's a great deal to be on when interest rates are going down. If interest rates go up, you get hurt very badly. And so the problem with volatility is not that commodities are volatile. What most people do to protect themselves from that is they sign a fixed rate mortgage for their home. So they don't have to worry about the volatility in interest rates if that's something that concerns them a lot. Other people may have other reasons. So it is a commodity. We can't store it. We depend a lot on it in our lives, and we do need to be very, very careful about how we move to a market. But it isn't that different from everything else. They do it in home heating oil in New England. We should be able to do it here with electricity if we can get it right like 20 other states have done.
Professor Pratt, you were among the not a normal commodity community.
I was. I study history, and I study changing philosophical climates in the history of regulation. And I think we need to understand that we are in the end of an era, I think, of kind of the worship of free market forces as a thing unto themselves, and is this abstract. It's almost like economic fundamentalism, where the theoretical writ's handed down, and this is what you should do, and you can't argue because efficiency and all this comes from it. I think there are non-economic factors that the economics profession has forgotten how to deal with. We used to call it political economy, but we don't anymore. It's economics. Nobody teaches political economy, as if democracy is not a part of the capitalist society. But there's non-economic factors that are really clear. First of all, we can't stand to have electricity peak and valley in cycles, boom and bust, and not be available when we need it to run our factories, to run our computers, to run our CD players. It's not like corn syrup. It's not like pairs of shoes. We can't stand in terms of national security to have uncertainty about electric supply. We can't. We can play like it, but we can't. It's a non-economic variable. We can't stand in terms of environmental policy. To play like electricity and energy isn't environmental intensive and doesn't have a dramatic impact on the cleanliness of the air and water. And also, we tend to forget this in the year 2001. We used to talk about this in America. it's very difficult to forget the non-economic factor. Poor people in any industrial society, if you price this commodity out of their range, it affects them dramatically. And to play like that's not true is to ignore reality at the expense of economics. And finally, as a historian, we can't treat this as just another economic commodity because it has been regulated for a century. And even if the economics profession can deliver these benefits 20 years down the line, we've got 20 years to get to them. Markets don't just emerge instantaneously. We learned that every time we deregulated. We're going to have to manage the transition unless we want to pay very high prices.
Professor Pratt, you said that markets don't just happen instantaneously, and Senator Bowen said markets just don't happen. Senator, would you like to take that up? Any further thoughts on that, since there seems to be a consensus there?
Sure. Well, I think, first, let me just say that ultimately whether or not electricity is an essential commodity that is different is determined by the people of the state of California, and if you put that question on the ballot, it wouldn't be close. And that is who decides the policy of whether energy and electricity is essential. And we need to keep that in mind, because this is a democracy. When it comes to markets, we have learned something difficult with electricity that we should have remembered from what happened to the stock market in the Great Depression, which is that you have to have a system of checks and balances. You've got to have a way to call a timeout, and you need to keep people, you need to have an assurance that if problems emerge, they will be dealt with. That manifestly did not happen in California. We would not have seen prices for electricity, which the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission thought would range from 3 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour, go up to as much as $1.50 a kilowatt hour with no action taken by anyone. And it was the religion of the free market that would lead to that, the belief that if you just turn these forces loose, everything would be fine. And perhaps in the macro sense, over a long period of time, that's true. But the economic disruption and the dislocation and the other non-economic values to that would be enormous. It is harder to run a market. When you regulate, here's what you do. You look at whether the utilities costs have been validly incurred. You throw some out that you didn't like, some tree trimming or whatever. You decide what margin of profit there should be, and then that's the price. That's what you have to do if you're the regulator. Markets are much harder because capital will do all sorts of creative things and find all kinds of ways to get around market rules and test the rules. So you need to have a much more sophisticated ability to call a timeout. We've seen this in our securities markets as recently as the last big stock market crash, where program trading was a big part of what caused the downfall of the market, and the SEC responded with rules that prohibit program trading when certain conditions are in effect. We don't have those kinds of checks and balances for electricity, and until we do, we will not have a market that the people of this country trust.
Mr. Fielder, you've had some experience of being regulated, and you've been curiously quiet on this issue. Can we hear from you?
Well, I was trying, Kevin, not to be labeled as a Luddite utility executive for what I'm about to say. But I guess when I think about it, the question I ask is, what problem were we trying to solve, or what problem are we trying to solve? I mean, how many of you before, let's say 1995, when this ball got rolling, how many of you worried about your electricity? Anybody? I mean, was it you woke up at night? Well, you must be an economics professor. You know, for most of our 4.3 million customers, the lights went on just about every time you flipped the switch, and when the bill came every month, I mean, you would like it to be lower. I mean, I like, every bill to be lower, but you didn't have to go out and take heart attack pills or take a second on your house, right? I mean, it was affordable. Our average residential bill is about $65 a month. And, most people can afford that for a reliable service. One thing that differentiates electricity from other commodities, and maybe, I'm not sure about corn syrup, but other kinds of things, is where the initiative and creativity and spontaneity for use of electricity comes is not from the wall socket. It's from the different kind of lights you can use, energy efficient lights. It's from the different kind of motors, hospital CT scanners, the things that plug into the wall. Once you get behind that socket, I mean, it is undifferentiated. It is strictly a commodity. And I think we've kind of got captivated a little bit with the idea that somehow there's going to be some great innovation that's going to come from electricity deregulation. Maybe a competitive market will drive prices down compared to a regulated market. But remember what the principle of a regulated market is. It's cost, right? I mean, regulation is supposed to deliver all the services that a utility delivers at cost. It includes a return on the money that the investors invest, but it fundamentally is at cost. So the question you have to ask is, and Professor Cicchetti and I were talking about this earlier, can a competitive market, just by design, assume you designed it perfectly, could you expect over time, on average, the competitive market to deliver electricity for less than cost? I don't think so. And so the question is, what problem are we trying to solve?
Mr. Dasovich?
Yeah, I think the problem, if you go back and people that raise their hand here, I mean, this was all way before my time, and I'm sure I can't really see that well, but probably a lot before, in fact, everybody's time here. But back in the 70s, when I did some research on this, if you go back and look at it, there was a little thing called a ratepayer revolt that went on under regulation. And cost is sort of a funny thing in regulation. There was a plant probably nobody here has heard about called Diablo Canyon, and it's a nuclear plant in Southern California. That plant was scheduled to cost $500 million. It ended up costing $6.5 billion. So cost is sort of a funny notion under regulation. And in terms of innovation and creativity and what problem are we trying to solve, I guess electricity is sort of an interesting commodity, but it reminds me of IBM telling Steve Jobs that you couldn't do anything better than a dummy terminal and a mainframe. And what was this wacky guy with long hair from Silicon Valley talking about? Nobody wanted something called a PC. There was no value to it. The thing about California that we need to keep in mind, that I want to bring us back to, is there's this notion that somehow Adam Smith walked into California and pulled a switch in well, I guess before you were involved with this stuff, 1998 or sometime around that time, and all of a sudden we had an Adam Smith-style electric industry. And I really would urge everybody to go back and look at this thing called deregulation. It was called AB 1890. And if you read that thing, I would defy you to find an economist that would find any market-based principle to that law. I mean, a market, you've got retail rates, as Senator Bowen said, you need to have the demand side working well. There wasn't anything about the demand side in California's experiment. You've got to have the wholesale side working well. I mentioned there was these funny institutions that nobody had heard of before. Didn't really have anything to do with wholesale markets. You've got to be able to get in and out, so-called entry and exit. Very difficult thing to do, and you had to have real choices. There were no real choices. And so I would get back to the question, if we want to find out if we can make it work in California and get the benefits that it provides for all other commodities, let's sort of look out to Pennsylvania and look to some other places that took care, understood it was an important commodity, but did some of the things the Senator talked about, tried to get the demand side right, tried to get some of these other aspects right, and put our shoulder to the wheel and try to get it right this time.
I'd like to ask a two-part question. Number one to Professor Pratt. Why did we change? Why in California? Why did we? If everything was as wonderful as described by Mr. Fielder, and I have no doubt about that, why did we change? And secondly, to Professor Cicchetti, why does he think we changed so wrongly?
I think regulation, as we practice it in this country, succeeded quite nicely, at least into the 1970s and early 1980s. And there's a confluence of problems that come tumbling into the utility system that stopped the ability of the utilities to keep delivering lower rates. Historically, we left them alone because the rates were tending downward for almost 75 years. And these are hard problems. We've mentioned several of them here already. I think the nuclear, we'll call it fiasco because it was in terms of societal investment, but it really was a blow to the heart of the utility industry. It's still trying to recover from in all kinds of ways. How do you get those stranded costs? How do you deal with the kind of the head fake toward nuclear power? The environmental movement asks very difficult things of the utility industry. There's still that takes some years to work out. the technology. The best historian of this process, a man named Richard Hirsch, has just published a new book about how we regulated and deregulate electricity over time. He has a theory of technological stasis that somewhere in there in the 70s or 80s, fossil fuel technologies quit giving us those good returns they've given us for all kinds of reasons. But there's all kinds of reasons why the old system that had succeeded well enough for us to leave it alone started attracting attention, particularly of economists. And I think the other answer to that is what I started with. We entered a period with the regulators, regulatory scholars at least call the economist hour, where the Reagan era forward, there's just an assumption, the pendulum swung toward the market because we're discouraged about government, and there's an assumption among the people designing regulation, Alfred Kahn, others, Democrats and Republicans, that we need to get out. And the promise is, and I don't know what I sound like, I believe in deregulation, but I want it in a little more orderly, managed fashion. The promise is that it'll be more efficient, and particularly the biggest problem with the regulated system historically was it wasn't as innovative as other unregulated industries that we could see. Innovative in delivering a product, innovative in lowering the cost. And I think if we can manage the process, for one thing, I don't think we can turn back. So the debate about whether to go back to the good old days, I think ended about 3 or 4 years ago in California. But I think the future will be better if we work over a long period of time. And I think the reason to ask these questions, why is it different, and answer them, because you start to define what the roles of government are going to have to be in the new order we create. We're going toward a market, but I don't think we'll ever get toward a real free market in electricity. I think that's, I thought it sounds almost silly to promise each other. There will be a public function. We have to decide what it's going to be and how we're going to organize it. Sorry to take so long.
Well, in saying we can't go back, you agree also with what Mr. Dasovich said, that we can't turn back the clock. Mr. Cicchetti, who designed this train with wings, or to use your initial metaphor? How did this mistake, from your perspective, how was it made?
You got to go back to the California-specific facts in the early 90s, and at the time we had twice the national average price of electricity. One reason was we had restrictions on the kind of fuel we could burn because of clean air. Second, we built nuclear plants when the cost kept rising because that was the only way to meet our growing population needs given the environmental restrictions about anything else. Third, we subsidized qualifying facilities and conservation because we didn't think people wanted to pay for those things, so we built them into the electric bills, and as a result, California's prices were twice the national average. We were in a recession in the early 90s, and the governor and the legislature at the time thought that we had to do something to make California competitive by bringing our electricity prices down, and they had something very important that they understood as a fact, and that is that California in the early 90s was oversupplied with electricity. So what better thing to do than to try to create a market-like reaction where excess supply could bring down prices. At the time, the price of electricity for generation was about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. The bills were 10 cents because there were other things thrown in, but generation was about a nickel. In 1998, the price of electricity in California fell to 2.5 cents. In 1999, it fell to 2.5 cents again. It was working. Excess supply was driving the price down. It was cutting California's generation costs to equal the national average. We were going to be competitive. That was great news. Consumer didn't see those price reductions because we had to deal with those excess nuclear plant costs that we had, those excess environmental subsidies and qualifying facility subsidies we built into the electric rates, but even those were starting to get paid off. 2001 looked like it was going to be the point where California was going to see rate reductions. What happened, we had a hot summer and a dry winter. It happens once every 50 years in the West. That's what happened in 2000. The market reacted to that supply shortage and that demand response, and the price went flying through the roof. And here's where the problem comes from, to answer the question. California is the only part of the world that went to markets for wholesale power and prohibited, in lots of ways, the use of long-term forward and futures contracts, what every other commodity that we trade in the world depend upon to get price fluctuations dampened and stabilized. To put it as succinctly as I can, California had 90% of all the electricity in the spot commodity market, 10% in forward contracts. Every other part of the world that deregulated did the exact reverse. They went 90% long and 10% spot. We prevented that from happening. That was our biggest mistake because it meant that when we had a hot summer and a dry winter, when we had natural gas prices go through the roof, when we had air quality emissions trading credits increase tenfold in price, all of those blew through the system unstably because we had no forward and futures contracts. The utilities asked the CPUC, change the rules, let us sign these contracts. The CPUC said, essentially, if you sign them, you're at risk, because if you bet wrong, you'll eat the difference. And they said, we can't do that. And then, effectively, we didn't move into those contracts. It wasn't until the governor came in, and now he's being blasted for it. And I'm a Republican, remember. He should get credit for this. When he forced the state into long-term contracts, he finally stabilized the system, and we haven't seen those price increases that we had before those long-term contracts were entered into. The markets need, if they're going to be a commodity, they need forward contracts, futures contracts, hedging, insurance, stabilizing long-term positions, not simply a commodity. That said, we're about to make a mistake from everything I'm hearing, and I'm not an historian, I'm just old, and I'll tell you what it means. I remember in the 60s and the 70s where we really screwed up oil and oil and natural gas prices because we said they come under national security concerns, and we got the government into those markets. It took 20 years to get them out, and those are not things we worry about. And I'll tell you, oil is as important for national security as electricity, and it's just, I think, wrong-headed to think that because we now have a new national security concern, we should somehow make electricity the government's responsibility. It's not. It's our responsibility. We have to respond to high prices when they're there, and if government, as they did in California, prevent that from happening, you'll be certain that we'll have a problem, and then we'll play the blame game, which is the way in which government usually responds when it causes the problem but doesn't want to take full responsibility for its actions.
Mr. Weissman, there's a lot of things you must be thinking about as these points are being made.
Yeah, I think we just circumnavigated the globe with that last set of comments, and there's a lot to talk about in there, and hopefully we can break it up into portions in the rest of the discussion, so I won't try to take all that on right now, but I'd like to try to get back to the question at hand in terms of why on earth did we move forward with the particular dangerous experiment that we're involved in. In the 70s, in the late 70s, we saw dramatically increasing oil prices largely because of the OPEC-driven crises. In the early 80s, we saw double-digit inflation that drastically increased the cost of borrowing for the utilities. In the mid-80s, we saw the introduction of completed nuclear plants that had vastly overrun their costs. Despite all of that, all of those factors together had nowhere near the impact of 1 or 2 days fluctuation in the wholesale market under the current experiment. Let me suggest that the reason we are in this particular pickle right now, why we entered into this experiment, has more to do, frankly, with a couple of factors. One is that there are large commercial and industrial customers in this state that realized that if they were able to take their demand out of the mix, if they were able to go buy their power somewhere else than directly from the utilities, that they had an opportunity, because their demand was so large relative to other users, to get the best price, the cheapest power available. They wanted to be freed up to be able to undertake those contracts. The experiment that we had with cogeneration and renewable energy projects through the 80s had demonstrated that there was potential for returns on investment that were higher than those that the utilities earned under their secure rate structure. The utilities started to look at that and started to think, well, maybe if we could be freed up to compete in these markets on the generation side as well, perhaps we could realize returns that are higher than the 10 or 12% that were allowed under regulation. Private companies that actually, frankly, mostly are utilities from other parts of the country that wanted to come here and buy power plants became very interested in trying to tap into that generation market as well. These are the factors that drove the legislative process and the regulatory process before the PUC toward the model that we have now. It's pretty enjoyable to hear Mr. Dasovich talk with such amazement about the structure in 1890, because it was Enron and many other enterprises that were involved in the negotiations that led to the structure that we're working with now. All of this was done under the name of providing customer choice. And I think, as has been asked more than once today, how many of us had been clamoring for the opportunity to be able to choose one electric provider over another? So I think, frankly, that these are the forces that got us where we are, not the economic forces that have been discussed so far.
Mr. Dasovich, Mr. Weissman suggests that these fluctuations in the wholesale market were there when you were negotiating previously. Did you prepare for those? Did you think the free market forces would carry just raising of prices, et cetera, that there would be no political reaction or we wouldn't find ourselves where we are now?
I'm not sure exactly. I actually don't understand the question. I'm not sure what he was referring to.
In other words, in terms of the formula that you're operating under now, those fluctuations had to have been predicted. What was the plan for those fluctuations? Certainly not the energy crisis that we experienced.
Well, I'll only talk for myself, and I guess I can actually speak for my company as well on that. My company was very strongly opposed to putting the state on a variable rate mortgage, and in fact very, very strongly urged the California Public Utilities Commission not to do that. Simply because everybody that knew anything about markets and commodities knew that they were wildly volatile. In fact, it might be one of the most volatile commodities in the world, and that, like every other commodity, at the retail level, you want to be served through contracts. Businesses need to know what the price for their input is going to be so they can plan for their businesses. Families need to have some idea of what that price is going to be so they can plan their family budget and not get hit with high interest rates like on a variable rate mortgage. And so everyone urged, some folks urged against having a spot market driven model. And in fact, people knew that was going to happen. I'm not sure if rhetorical flourishes are really constructive in trying to get us out of this, but, I guess I would ask everybody in the room, how many people, said, all I want is a black rotary AT&T phone? I mean, I didn't see anybody marching in the streets for that either, though I think that we probably value our communication devices today, that deregulation of the communication industry has gotten us, though I, like everybody else, probably doesn't like getting phone calls at dinner.
Senator Bowen, politically, from your point of view, is there any other issue that has this intensity in your political career, or even maybe historically in the history of the state?
The only thing that comes close is water. And there are many people who think that we are setting ourselves up to experience shortages in water as well. But I think part of the difficulty is that very, very largely the people of the state, regular people, were not clamoring for customer choice. The one thing that they did want was access to renewable power markets, and that they have gotten. They got that in LADWP and in SMUD territory and in many places where there are municipal utilities through other products. So I think it's possible for that kind of innovation to happen, and in fact, I would note that the only utility in the country that's gone exclusively to time-of-use metering is a municipal utility. It's Puget Sound. 600,000 time-of-use meters have been deployed there. So to make the assertion that only a competitive market can lead to innovation, I think is wrong. And I think we also need to keep in mind that we had and still have a wholesale market for electricity. Our municipal utilities and our investor-owned utilities in California and throughout the West engaged in a wholesale market that worked quite nicely because it was in all of their interest to do so. So this question really is about retail markets, not about wholesale markets.
Real quickly,
Professor Brown.
on this issue, I think the thing that I wish we could think about and leave from the conference, in the future, let's just start with my opinion that all government intervention involvement in the economy is not the same and that all is not necessarily evil. We say we now have a free enterprise in oil. One of the really key issues in electricity has an analogy in oil, and that's the capacity to meet the load. Will the market deliver that enough excess capacity to assure that when we need the electricity, we'll have it? The old regulated system was very good at that at a high cost, but very good at that. In oil, we had a horrible experiment with price controls in the 1970s. Stupid public policy failed. Nobody would ever want to do that again. But at the same time, we have now spent billions of dollars, our tax dollars, to build something called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is publicly owned oil in the ground on the Gulf Coast to use in case we have a shortage of imported oil. That's the kind of thing. Surely we're creative enough as a society to think creatively about government and find ways to move toward a market and keep those kind of issues and be willing to say, well, maybe government will have a role in those bigger sort of national and economic security issues. We've done it always in our history, and I no reason why we can't do it now.
Mr. Wiseman?
But the question is, why put patches on the system? When I hear this discussion about ways to use, for instance, the new power authority in California to shore up the reserve margin or to create some sort of a strategic reserve of power, frankly, what I hear, it's from the bias of somebody who's been involved in regulation for a long, long, long time, is, gee, how can we return the qualities that we had in the system that we just gave up? Why are we looking for ways to patch up something that's not giving us the things that satisfy us? Why not use an approach that would be more centrally managed and more predictable in terms of price and reliability?
Mr. Larson first. I'd like to respond to take that point up because...
You mean why not go back to a regulated environment?
If that's a question you want to answer, go ahead.
Sure. I don't think we can. I mean, I think that where we are is that it's sort of, we're facing a hybrid. There are plenty of forces interested in a free market, as you've seen here tonight, and I think it would be idealistic to begin to say that you could go back to a fully regulated market the way it was before deregulation. It's going to be something different. I'm not sure what, and I don't know what it's going to look like. What we've talked about here are a lot of the problems that have been faced. I think the way it will be solved will be what succeeds in terms of what the government does. And whether that is forward contracts or extending those forward contracts or not is an issue. Whether or not the power authority is an answer. Whether or not conservation succeeds. What happens with generation in terms of state approvals and regulation. Whatever succeeds is what I think will be favored in terms of public policy in the future. It's going to be a combination of things. And there will be influences new influences that come along. For example, I think that in terms of renewables, the effort to increase the size of renewables in California, I think, was enhanced considerably by the security issues that came up on September 11th. They make for an independent source of energy. I think from now on, people are going to look at that and say, oh, well, let's see what we can do here to accelerate some of that. I mean, we are never fixed in place. Change is always occurring. And how the government reacts and tries to solve these problems, or acts and tries to solve the problems, is the key. That's the thing that we have to look for. And as happens in most very complex policy issues, it's probably going to be done in piecemeal. Deregulation was done all at once. And that, in fact, because it was not done or phased in or done in pieces, may indeed be one of the reasons why it's such a spectacular failure in California. And I don't mean to say that there aren't forms of the free market system that may work. It's just this particular model didn't work. And we're not going to go back. We're not going to use the free market system. I think it's very academic to talk about, how the free market system would work. It doesn't matter if it would work. The people, the voters of California, are pretty convinced that whatever it was didn't work, and something else is going to have to take its place, and that's the challenge of the moment.
Well, there are some of us who don't think the word academic is a pejorative term.
I don't always use it that way either.
Professor Cicchetti, for instance, I don't think does.
No, I don't.
So, Professor Cicchetti, you wanted to...
Yeah, I'd like to make a very important point that I think we're not getting, and it's the following. If we had had cost of service regulation during the last 5 years, in other words, if we hadn't gone through the so-called experiment, somebody would have had to been dealing with the fact that the price of natural gas in 2001 hit $60 a million BTUs. $60 a million BTUs means nothing to anybody, but in the context of electricity, in California, if we have to pay that much for a million BTUs of natural gas, the price of electricity just for the fuel is $600 a megawatt hour or 60 cents a kilowatt hour. Your typical bill is 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So there would have been somebody that would have had to pay that extra 50 cents for every kilowatt hour that was used. Under cost of service regulation, and I'm a former state regulator from Wisconsin, the pressure to raise rates would have been very high, especially because fuel isn't the responsibility of the electric generator, and a $60 per million BTU price for natural gas would have been viewed as a problem that would have had to be passed on to the consumer. In 2000, the price of NOx credits in Southern California, which were usually a couple of dollars a pound, jumped to $50 a pound. That alone would have added 10 cents a kilowatt hour of electricity, doubling, if nothing else happened in that year, doubling everybody's bill in California just to buy clean air credits in December of 2000. These are facts that the electric generators didn't cause. AB 1890 didn't plausibly cause. They were caused by shortages of gas in the system, shortages of NOx in the system. And why did we have shortages? The answer is we had incredibly high demand in 2000, and we had incredibly low hydro conditions in 2000. It was a very odd year, and somebody would have had to pay those prices. It's not a failed experiment when shortages caused by earthquakes or climate or whatever natural phenomena causes things to respond. What we have to understand is, normally, we would have had the buffer of a regulatory process to stabilize the way we'd phase in those increases. In California, we didn't have that buffer, except for the fact that in some ways we did, because we didn't raise retail prices until into January of 2001, when we finally got around to raising retail prices. And now what we're going to see is California, to get the utilities out of bankruptcy and to get the Department of Water Resources out of the indebtedness from buying electricity, we're going to have to keep our electricity prices in California where they are now out about 10 years. That means that instead of having our rates fall to the level of the rest of the country, they're going to have to be higher than the rest of the country for at least a decade. The good news is our economy is strong enough to probably withstand it. We're already paying the bills, and we're likely, if wholesale prices, because everybody's coming in to try to build to respond to the shortage, the market's as stupid as regulators were in terms of creating oversupply. We're building to beat the band in California, and now the prices are below what they were in 1998 because we're overbuilding and we're still conserving. If California still conserves, all these people coming in building are going to drive the price of energy down. We won't see it on our bills immediately, but this 10-year burden of trying to make up for our mistakes or our bad luck, and I think of it more as bad luck, but there were mistakes as well, we'll pay that probably out to about 2010. We may get lucky and see some price reductions sooner because the wholesale markets really are at an all-time low here in the West.
My instincts are, as a dutiful civil servant, are to go to Senator Bowen, but Mr. Weissman is so fidgety that I know he has something to say here. Mr. Weissman.
I'm constructed to be fidgety, but there, you know, and we can throw around big numbers. You talk about $60 gas. I could talk about $1,500 megawatt hours, but you know, those are horror figures drawn off of odd points on the graph. What I think it's important to remember, we looked at those prices. We looked at the relationship between the prices, the costs that were being faced in terms of gas and pollution credits, and compared it to the prices that were being charged through the wholesale market, and there was no relationship.
That's not true.
Unless you want to look for some sort of multiplier. If the price went up a little bit for gas, the wholesale price for electricity went up like that. The fact is that the generators aren't sitting around waiting to see what the border price for gas is going to be. They're planning for their gas needs. They're entering into long-term contracts, and they're leveling off the costs that they're going to be facing. Those $50 pollution credits, those were faced by the last generator for their most incremental generation. The fact of the matter is that almost none of the generators were paying those credits. But we compared those costs. We assumed that everybody was paying high credits. We assumed that everybody was paying high gas prices, and looked what happened just in the summer of months of the year 2000, just in one market, just in the PX day-ahead market, and found that the prices had exceeded costs by well over $4 billion in those markets.
And I found just the opposite. So one of us have numbers that are just not making sense. The day-ahead market price was below the marginal cost. If you define not marginal cost as the average of everybody's cost, but the true marginal cost taking into account what the price of gas was on a particular day, the price of NOx credits on a particular day, those numbers exceeded the price in the day-ahead market. You only find prices going above those numbers when you go into the out-of-market sales. And that's where you have these wonderful municipal utilities megawatt laundering and saying, we're only adding 15% above our cost, but they're defining their cost as $800 a megawatt hour because they're looking at the gas price of $60 and they're looking at the NOx price of $50, and then they're saying 15% on top of that, that's $800 a megawatt hour for electricity. The pirates in this world are the public power folks in Canada and in LADWP and to some extent in SMUD.
Mr. Fielder, not that I'm picking up on pirates here, Mr.
Thank you, Kevin. I think one thing I learned in this last legislative session, that trying to figure out what happened and who was to blame over the last 3 years doesn't lead you to any place where you want to be. And I looked at the title of the conference called Envisioning California, and maybe I thought I'd give 2 seconds on what we see from Southern California Edison's point of view, what we see coming down the road. I think I agree with Charlie on several of the elements, but the thing that I think that most of you folks are interested in is prices, and I agree with Charlie that for the next few years, I wouldn't say 10, but I think probably for the next 3 to 4 years, the price levels that we see today in your bills are going to be stable. I don't think they're going to go up very much. I don't think they're going to go down very much. And I say that both for Southern California Edison and PG&E. I think PG&E is about in the same boat from that standpoint. So those of you that thought you were going to see a big price decrease in the next 2 or 3 years coming off the 40% average price increase that we got earlier this year, I wouldn't expect it. Longer term, I think you'll see some moderation in retail rates. And I think the power plants that are coming in and the basic cost structure that underlies those power plants, I think you'll see costs start to fall in the 4 to 5 year time frame. What that means is that the states and the utilities and the public power companies' emphasis on conservation, on energy efficiency, on being smart users of electricity is going to be absolutely essential for the well-being of the state. And, you know, I don't think, I mean, I can add my personal plea to please conserve. And I think the programs that we've had in this place this last summer, the 2020 program, some of the demand response programs, some of the real-time metering programs, I think we can see what happens when Californians put their mind to it. And we've seen reductions that we never thought that we would ever see. I think you're going to see a continuation of this. The state has entered into long-term power contracts, 10-year power contracts. I don't think that you're going to see significant, and they're above market. They contracted at the time when prices were high. And some of their effort contributed to stabilizing the market, and that is good. So prices are lower now than they were back when they contracted, but we're going to be paying more for those contracts in the future than what the underlying cost structure is. I don't think we're going to be able to get out of those, and if we do, it won't be significant cost reductions. I think that from what you see on the ground from the utilities, whether it's SMUD or DWP or PG&E or Edison, in terms of the kind of customer service, the responsiveness to service outages, reliability, I think you're actually going to see an improvement in the levels of service that the utilities are delivering. Because when we get in a crisis mode like we're going to be in, I mean, service is where it's at, and you're going to see the utilities stepping up with more attention, more responsiveness, and more service than you've probably seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And at least that's kind of my crystal ball when we envision where the energy or the electricity business and the electricity infrastructure is going. That's what I see over the next 3 to 4 years. 10 years from now, we'll let the forecasters figure that out.
Senator Bowen?
I want to tease apart some of the discussion of Professor Cicchetti, and perhaps it's dangerous to argue with an economics professor, but I think much of what he said is wildly inaccurate. In a regulated environment, we would not have seen natural gas at $60 a million BTU, and we wouldn't have seen NOx at $50 a credit. And the fact that natural gas went that high, there are two factors we need to look at. First, FERC has a pipeline manipulation case right now against El Paso Natural Gas for selling pipeline capacity to one of its affiliates and precluding it from being used. So there wasn't a free market in a competitive and workable market in gas pipeline capacity, and we were paying 10 to 15 times as much for natural gas as you were paying on the other side of the Arizona border 2 feet away. So that certainly isn't a function of the electricity market. And if you look at the chart and you lay over the date, December 12th, when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission removed the temporary price cap from the California market, you will see that the price of natural gas on that day shot almost straight up. I believe that was a direct result of the increase in the electricity prices, not the other way around. Most important, though, is we did not have a physical shortage of the commodity of electricity in December of 2000. We did not have a physical shortage. We used very little electricity in December. There was plenty. We did not have a dry winter yet in April, May, and June of 2000 when wholesale prices started to skyrocket in San Diego. So the assertion that all of this can be pegged solely on the physical shortage, I think, really misses a discussion about what makes electricity trading very different than trading in other commodities, and back to the marketing, to the monitoring and oversight of markets. Those NOx credits went up because the price of electricity was so high that anybody who could generate on the margins at those times was willing to pay almost anything, and it almost destroyed a very functional market for NOx credits in the LA basin. So I think we need to be very careful here when we say that, gee, it was the cost of the inputs and that those would have had to be passed through. I don't think we would have seen the inputs have those kinds of price spikes in a regulated environment, and we wouldn't have seen it in a well-regulated market either.
Mr. Tasevich, and then we'll go to the audience for questions.
Very, very briefly, I think one statement that Senator Bowen just made is incredibly important. She said a very well-functioning NOx market in Southern California. What she's talking about are pollution credits that you can trade almost in a free market, but they are regulated, and they were very careful how they put it together. If you had asked anybody, maybe even 5 years ago, I know 10 years ago for sure, particularly from the environmental community or anybody, average person on the street, that you could make a market and get cleaner air by creating tradable pollution credits, they would have told you were out of your mind. It was a very, very successful thing. I think it's very informative and something we should be looking at when we're talking about how to do such an important industry like electricity. I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian, but I am a Californian. And there are two observations I have. One sort of shorter term, one longer term. The shorter term one is we've been spending a heck of a lot of time, and this sort of turned into a pretty deep Wong session here. You're looking at some people who are the most knowledgeable, other than myself, about this industry on this panel, and you see what happens about this complicated industry. But we've been arguing for a heck of a long time, and it's time to get something done. The second issue is more of a longer term. I think it's a California, and being California, it's sort of a pathological problem we have. We don't like to look out and see what other people have done and maybe just build off of what they did and make it better on the margin. Oh no, we have to wipe the slate clean and we have to try it our own way. If there's one thing that this panel agrees on, and I haven't heard a heck of a lot of agreement, but if there's one thing I think this panel agrees on, the model that California used for electricity was wrong and it failed. And now it's a question of what we are going to do next. And I think what we do to get it right is we do sort of what Senator Bowen talked about. Let's look at other industries and see how they worked, whether it's the NOx market there or the natural gas market in California. Every person in this room could have chosen, has had the ability to choose a natural gas provider for the last 10 years. Know it or not, you could choose, not if you were a municipal utility, but another one. Large customers have been choosing a gas supplier for over 10 years in the state of California. And guess what? It's worked very well. We didn't create these funky, weird, bizarre things nobody had heard about called ISOs and PXs. We didn't have to have bizarre, intricate rate structures on the retail side that didn't work, that the senator referred to, that only very, very long-time, high-priced consultants understand. It was very simple. It was based on all the other markets that we all know and use every single day. So if we want to go back and if we want to try to get it done right, we can do that. Look at the bill that Senator Bowen tried to pass this last session. It was a complicated session. She tried to take all of these complicated factors at hand into account. She tried to be fair to everybody because it's been a mess we got to unwind our way out of. And she did a bill that would still allow you and businesses to go out and choose somebody other than the utility. We need to take that as an example. We need to get that bill back in the public debate and look at pragmatic ways to move forward from here. And I would argue that that's one very, very good step to get us from here to there. And we could look back. It's important to learn from the mistakes, but we really, as Californians, got to get out of this mess, and we're only going to do it if we start looking forward.
Thank you, Mr. Dasovich. Now I would like to go to the audience for questions, and we'll do this in this manner. If you could wait till the microphone comes to you, because we're recording this. The lady there in the white sweater, please, up this direction. There she is, right on the aisle there, please. Please, sir, would you sit down for a second? Thank you.
Hi, thank you, panel. I would like to address Mr. Larson's comment about renewable sources in a context that, from what I understand from a panel this morning, the PUC has eliminated our ability as consumers for direct access to renewable resources. Now, in the context of national security and perhaps a problem with supply shutoffs because of unknown circumstances in the next 10 years, how can we tap into those alternative sources with these constrictions?
I don't know about direct access. There are lots of problems with that policy, and it certainly will impinge. It will be a negative factor in the development of renewables, I think. However, there are many ways in which renewables are developed, and in terms of wind power, for example, which already provides a fairly large amount of megawatts to the state, in terms of the base, I certainly think that that's one area that will respond. I think also in terms of distributed generation, solar power, solar devices of one sort and another are other areas in which have a security overtone will be enhanced, and we're going to see much more of that. There are other areas, too, in which renewables, I think, will become more important. We're having problems at the moment in terms of price, for example, for biomass facilities, and yet, at the same time, they offer much in terms of generating other types of megawatts. So I think that, that we will go further in investigating how best to bring renewables online during the next few years, and because of the security issues, I think that will be enhanced. The legislature is going to be more interested in it, the administration will be, and I think you're going to see some really new development there. The administration is already committed to 17% within 5 years. It's at about 12% of the supply at the moment. Most people think we can get to 20% pretty easily, and that was before the security issue came about. We may be able to do better than that. I hope so.
Mr. Wiseman, you wanted to speak to this?
Yes, the good news about direct access was that anywhere up to excess of 50% of those small customers who signed up for direct access specifically signed up to get green power, to get renewable power. The bad news is that almost nobody signed up for direct access. The program was not a large attraction in California, and the fact is, if you look at the trends in other parts of the country where there has been the availability of direct access, you'll find that there might have been an initial excitement and a flurry of activity, but there have been trends down in most markets in terms of the number of participants, especially on the small consumer level. The fact of the matter is that if we want to promote renewables in California, and I think most of us do, I think we're going to have to look for ways to do that in a way that all of us can share in that project and share in the burden, as opposed to simply relying on individuals to be motivated to seek out a supplier who's going to give them green power, and in some instances pay a premium in order to do that. This is a social concern, an environmental concern. It's something we all should be working on together, I think. The PUC has been involved in implementing more legislation than the bill that told the PUC to stop direct access. It's also been implementing legislation that asked for the PUC to set up incentives for renewables on the decentralized level. The Commission has directed the utilities to spend cumulatively, I think, upwards of $200 million a year over the next several years in renewable incentive programs. You may be familiar with the Energy Commission's buy-down program. For instance, if you were to put photovoltaics on the roof of your house, the Commission dramatically increased the level of that incentive payment so that you could get something like, I think, $4.50 per installed watt, and you could accumulate those incentives up to about 50% of the cost of the solar system. So there are things being done on the distributed level to promote renewables. Also, the new power authority that the legislature created has the directive to spend at least $1 billion in investments within the next 5 years on renewables. And so the programs are continuing. The question is whether we'll get back to a point where there can be some form of centralized generation resource planning, and where we can have a portfolio of technologies that includes a significant amount of renewables as well.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please. Go ahead, sir.
You know, with all due respect, I think it's great for the state of California to try to foster renewables, and we ought to be doing that. But I just want to put a plug in for the individual here. I just heard the word centralized and managed so many times in that one answer. I see individuals in California going out and making very, very smart environmental choices across a broad array of areas of their lives every single day. And the notion that somehow we ain't smart enough or shouldn't have the opportunity to do that as individuals from an environmental perspective with respect to the energy choices that we make, I just find that just a little bit shocking.
The gentleman there in the blue shirt.
Yeah, thanks. My question
Would
concerns
you speak to the mic? You have the microphone?
Sure. Is it on?
Would you stand up, please, sir?
And my question concerns the long-term energy contracts the state has signed. Mr. Fielder and Professor Cicchetti sort of touched on it, but I'd wondered from the other panelists if you could talk about what you see as the impact on the state's economy and its energy costs from these contracts, and then whether you think they can be renegotiated, if that's that's what people want to do.
Should we start with Senator Bowen?
Well, you know, the state's in a difficult situation because the Department of Water Resources did negotiate the contracts, and while I think Professor Cicchetti is right that they did break the upward trend in the spot market, I think we went significantly beyond what was necessary to do that, and that we could potentially see a significant damage to our economy. I think that it is the responsibility of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to help us undo this. We have to keep in mind that all of this comes from the Federal Power Act, which requires that rates in the wholesale market be just and reasonable. That's still there, as much as FERC would like to pretend it's not. And it is that duty to ensure just and reasonable wholesale prices that is the foundation of the state's action for refunds, and I believe should also include a plea to reform the contracts that never would have looked like that had FERC originally done its duty to ensure just and reasonable wholesale rates. So that's where I think that needs to be done, and I think it is something that should be done. But this may be like the tobacco litigation. It may take a long time to unwind all the consequences of the various things that have happened as a result of letting the market go wild.
Professor Cicchetti?
Yeah, just a couple of numbers. I think about numbers. These contracts are 70-cent or 7-cent electricity contracts, essentially, $70 megawatt hour contracts. They're only for about 25% of what the state uses. So it's not like we're locked in for all of our electricity at 7 cents indefinitely or for 10 years. It's only 25% of our total usage are under these contracts. 7 cents, what does that mean? Well, when you put a 40% increase on 5 cents, you get to 7 cents. So we could literally pay the current price we're paying for electricity today indefinitely at 7 cents and not have a rate increase. So it's not going to damage the economy any more than it might already have damaged us. That said, there are two other factors to think of. The other 75% of the electricity we're using, because of those contracts, are now trading at 2.5 cents, and that they're falling. And that money that we're saving, because we're not seeing that fall yet in the wholesale prices, is being used to bail out Edison and PG&E, if you want to think of it that way, or at least to pay them back for when they had to overcharge or overpay into the market and couldn't pass it on to the retail customers. It's going to be used to pay back the state. The governor has also got a rate cap in effect in the West at 9 cents. That's holding prices in check. Again, that's 7 cents below 9 cents. And finally, we've got the governor won a battle I never thought he could win, which is to succeed in convincing the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to have refunds based upon a calculation of what the cost of electricity was, not what the price in the free market was, and make the difference be paid back to California and the people in California who overpaid in the market. Now, we don't yet know the size of those refunds, but the estimates are in the billions. A conservative estimate is there'll be at least $1 billion. And so we've got relief coming that will benefit the economy and will bring prices down. One, we have excess supply relative to demand. We keep conserving, prices will come down. Two, we have refunds coming. Three, we have a price cap. And these contracts, while they seem high compared to 2.5 cent electricity, and they are, they're less than the price caps, and they're doing their job. Now, we have to dig our way out of it, but indeed we will. And the only good news, there's some more good news in all this for us, and let me just be positive for a moment. First bit of good news in all this is that while California pays a lot more for electricity than the rest of the country, we also use the least amount of electricity per capita of any other state in the country except for, I think, New Hampshire. So we don't use a lot of electricity as much as we think of ourselves as being an energy-intensive, sophisticated group of Californians. The second bit of good news is that because we're building all these new power plants, they're going to drive out the old inefficient power plants, and because we've got the most advanced conservation programs and now retail incentives for conservation programs of anybody in the world, California is the fourth largest economy, I believe, will be able to give us something for the extra money we're paying, and that will be California will be able to say to the rest of the world, we as an industrial economy can indeed comply with the Kyoto Protocol. Now, no other country has said that, despite all the rhetoric you've heard bashing the United States for not signing the Kyoto Agreement. But California is damn close to being able to get there. And we will get there probably when these new, more efficient gas-fired plants come in and back out the old ones. And if California keeps conserving, which is the direct response of both the price we're paying and the new rate design that the governor and the CPUC and the legislature are all encouraging. So there's good news in this, and the good news is a better place, a more a place that can demonstrate to the rest of the world you can have a strong economy and an incredibly high improvement in air quality, at least in terms of CO2 emissions, and you can pay for all that and still be at the bottom of the nation in terms of electricity consumption.
To get back to your question, I think that those contracts are problems, and how we get out of it, how they're solved is not clear yet. It has to be done pretty quickly. The impact that I see is on state government, in that unless there's a solution and there's some return on this investment very quickly, it's going to cause other kinds of dislocation. Certainly the other programs that the state sponsors and supports, like education, will be affected. There are already within state government are calls for 3, 5, 10% reductions in general fund expenditures, and much of it comes because of the shortfalls caused by the expenditure for energy. And so something has to be done very quickly about trying to come to grips with the issue. That being said, it is true that these long-term contracts did help to stabilize the situation. The quicker they can be renegotiated, or some of them can be renegotiated, I think the better. But the main thing is to find a way to pay back the state.
Yes, ma'am.
I guess if you were to ask me what my lesson was that I learned from the electricity crisis, even though you didn't ask me, I guess I would say that we can't predict, let alone control, the conditions that will bring about price fluctuations and fluctuations in supply of natural gas. And having said that, I have concerns about what we've been talking about, the long-term contracts, and the fact that they are almost exclusively dealing with natural gas at fossil fuel facilities. And I wanted to pose the question, where do we go from here in that? If there is really no possibility of renegotiating these contracts, how do consumers gain confidence and gain stability in the market and in their prices, and where do we go from there if it's hopeless in that sense?
Mr. Wiseman?
Well, yes, there's a tremendous dependency on natural gas that's, I think, to some extent increased by these long-term contracts. I mean, the theory is, of course, that as you, many of these contracts, as I understand it, are for new generating units that are going to be new technology. They'll be more efficient than the old ones, so they'll be able to generate as much electricity and use less natural gas, and that's going to, in theory, at least in the medium term, help bring down gas demand. But as we depend on natural gas more and more as a resource for electricity, yes, we were very dependent on fluctuations in gas prices. I think some folks who heard me in a panel this morning heard me explain that there were several conditions that tended to exacerbate the high prices that we saw last winter for natural gas, and Senator Bowen has already touched on some of those. There were some increases in price at the wellhead where the gas is drawn from the ground, because there had been, I think, an under-prediction in terms of what was needed regionally for, in natural gas. The high price signals, of course, helped encourage people to increase production. There had been confiscatory prices charged at the California border for moving that gas in, as Senator Bowen has already mentioned. The entity that was controlling the pipeline into California at that time no longer does. And the prices, in fact, went down dramatically at the border the day that that entity stopped controlling access to the border. And the third factor was that last winter, the reserves of gas that we have in wells in California, because storage is an important part of gas service, those reserves were lower than they needed to be. So when the high prices occurred at the border, folks had an inability to go to those reserves and pull out the gas that they needed. The utilities have responded to that this year by meeting and exceeding historical expectations in terms of how much gas they put into storage. They did a lot of that at high prices because the prices were high when they started that process toward the end of the winter. But the result is that this year we have every reason to expect that the gas prices are going to remain more stable. We obviously have to continue to monitor that very quickly, very closely, as long as we have this dependency on natural gas as a resource. And obviously, it motivates us all the more to try to move toward a more rounded portfolio with fuel diversity and an emphasis on renewables.
Professor Pratt and then Mr. Fielder.
Yeah.
Sound like a Texan for a while, if not a stockholder in Enron. That's good news. Growing dependence on natural gas is good news in the long term. Deregulation is 20 years down the road in natural gas. It is working in ways that economists promised it would, to the point where I think we, as a nation, we can depend on the fact there's going to be relatively abundant, it's relatively clean, and it is domestic, if you include Canada in that. It's the best energy source out of the big ones out there that you could hope to be becoming dependent on. I think it's good news. In terms of deregulation, one of the things, again, a Texas perspective, California, if you want more natural gas in California, one of the real easy things you could do is open access to more pipelines. And I know that's a hard thing to do, but in the history of gas pipelines over the last 30 years, every major pipeline that's had natural gas and come this direction, except for one, from where the natural gas is, has thrown up their hand and said, we can't do it with California, we'll go sell it somewhere else. So, and I wish that wasn't true. And I'm a California, and I lived here 6 years, and a California type environmentalist, but gas pipelines aren't a bad thing. Gas pipelines that can give you natural gas are a good thing over the long term.
Yeah, I was just going to add to your specific question. I understand that a number of the contracts that the state has signed do in fact have fixed gas prices, so that not all of them, but some of them would not be exposed to the volatility in gas prices that we saw last winter. And I was also going to mention the point that Joe just made, that there are a number of new gas pipeline infrastructure investments that the CEC is monitoring that are being made, which should increase the supply into California.
Senator?
Just a brief note. I mean, I think I'm really concerned, and it's a great question, and I asked that question when I first saw the contracts. But the best hedge we have against, as a state, against more price fly-ups and disruptions is on the demand side of the meter. It's going to be putting all of our large customers on real-time pricing, so that they're not in a situation where, I mean, electricity is unique in this regard, where the more you buy, the more it costs to get the last unit. And our rates for large customers and for residences haven't reflected that. So doing the work on the demand side of the meter, going to real-time metering for large customers, moving towards time-of-use metering cautiously, because there's social issues that we need to be concerned about for residential customers, and continuing to work aggressively towards energy efficiency, I think will help, as well as the renewable portfolio push. And the governor's office has made a commitment since the contracts came out to sign additional renewable contracts. I know the Power Authority is committed to having the largest solar energy installation in the world in California, and we will drive the price of the manufacture of solar panels and solar facilities down, I think, so that in 10 years from now, we won't need to subsidize it the same way.
It was just such a good question. It's hard not to respond to it. It speaks to the fact that you don't want to be dependent on one fuel anytime, no matter what the fuel is, which is, I think, why, again, we want to be extremely skeptical of centralization, because it's faddish. The big fad, I'm not a historian, as I said before, but I've learned from historians that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. The fad we had in the 70s was oil, oil, oil. Oil prices went up, and guess what? Our prices went through the roof. Well, nuclear is the new best thing. Let's have everybody build nuclear plants, and we did that. That was a bust, to say the least. Natural gas is a great fuel. It's a wonderful fuel. But if you're over-reliant on it, we're going to repeat oil, and we're going to repeat nukes. And so centralization has gotten us some real big problems when a few people think they can sit in a room and figure it out best. We need some people watching what's going on. The Energy Commission, for example, does a great job of keeping track of what we're using, and they are great at sending up flags when they have concerns about what the mix is. But at the end of the day, the senator is absolutely right. You want to attack this from the demand side, both with respect to real-time and demand responsiveness, but also giving people choices to go out and diversify for us through green or whatever they want to choose.
Yes, ma'am.
I know the new Power Authority is talking about building or financing to build about 15% excess capacity in power plants over the next 5 years. I'm wondering how the panel sees these state-owned, state-run facilities interacting with the private deregulated side of the market.
I think they're not necessary. I mean, the fact is, we are moving into an excess supply situation again. That's why the price has fallen to the lowest level it's been in 5 years. In the wholesale market that nobody's regulating, nobody's watching, but if you look in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal every day, you can find what the price is. And even when it hit 100 degrees in most of Southern California a week ago, I pulled out the paper to see if prices might have moved up, and they hadn't. They're still at the lowest level they've been in 5 years. So now for us to come along and say, we're going to build with state money plants that are sitting there to be used in case of emergency, that's just the concrete and steel equivalent of the state having long-term contracts at 7 cents that we think are too expensive. The fact is that whenever you go into a market and you try to have the government guarantee something, it's likely that the government's about 6 months behind where the curve should be. And therefore, what we have to keep in mind that the way markets work, if we want markets, I'm willing to go back to cost of service regulation if we want to. As many mistakes as we had and as expensive as it was, I'll go back there if that's what we want to do. But if we want markets, the way markets work, we do get surges in prices when there are shortages. That money gets spread over all the other hours in the year when prices are below what the capital costs and the recovery costs are, and that's how markets make their investors whole. And there's no guarantee for investors in those markets, but that's the way markets work. We don't need to build in these kinds of requirements for capacity, but we have to make certain that if we're going to rely on markets, that we let markets form their own forward and futures and long-term contract positions, bilateral, something that Enron championed, but everybody else in the state fought against it. PG&E, Edison, they didn't like long-term contracts. They thought that what would happen is people would sign long-term contracts and they wouldn't be able to recover their stranded cost. So we made all those mistakes, but now going forward, we shouldn't make new ones. We should either have a market and not try to prescribe all these special rules to fit last month's problem or last year's problem. We should rely on markets. If we don't want to rely on markets, let's go back to cost of service regulation. Let's buy back the stuff we sold off, or find a way to buy it as we need it, but build the new stuff under regulation. I think those are the two choices we have. But we shouldn't do it for some new reason like national security.
I think this is where we started, and I think
Please.
this is a real good thing for us to worry about. I believe in excess capacity, partly because it works so well in the old system. I like to have it, just like I like to have the strategic petroleum reserve sitting there. But the problem is if we have markets for all the regular use of electricity, we've got to find a more creative way to have that reserve capacity. I don't know what it is now, but those are the kind of questions we need to think about. I think that's clearly a role of government. And to say we're going to have markets or the old regulated system, I don't believe that. I think we're moving towards something else, some other mixture of more market and different sorts of government security regulatory policies to deal with these exceptional characteristics of electricity. And we don't know what they are yet, but we need to get cracking thinking about them hard.
We have one more question. This gentleman here, I haven't been able to get to him. Sir, would you speak into the microphone? Thank you.
The issue of public power hasn't been addressed. The San Francisco, next month, in all probability, will vote to establish it. Wouldn't it seem that given the fact that there is a lot of greed in the power industry and the importance that the best course of action is an out-and-out state takeover of the power industry to get the profit motive out and to get it so that it is under the control of the public? I mean, the cities with public power didn't have these problems.
Go ahead, Mr. Larson.
I think that the issue of public power is indeed an important one, and it's an important policy question that hasn't been resolved. I think that before deregulation, that there was a fairly clear differentiation between what public power was in California and what it was not. With deregulation and after the current experiences, I think that there have been efforts to expand the role of public power in California. Most interestingly, I think at the Power Authority, where you have proposals to build or buy power, mostly build peaking plants that would be either public or quasi-public. Certainly the money would come from the state. Raises the issue pretty dramatically, and it really goes to the issue of who's going to own what. Is the state or the public going to own the peaking power, and the private sector own the base? Would it be competitive for the private sector to own a piece of the peaking power while the state owns the rest? I think these are really important issues and questions that haven't been resolved and should be one of the more interesting policy decisions that the legislature gets to make next year.
I think your premise is wrong in terms of the past year. The people who charge the highest prices, the greediest of the bunch, the people who waited to the last minute to finally deliver the power to the market were LADWP and BC Hydro. They're the ones, they're both publicly owned. They didn't lack greed for a minute. They took advantage of the squeeze in the market. I don't care whether the market jumped up with gas prices or electricity prices. The greediest of the greedy were the publicly owned utilities who played the game to the hilt. So the premise, I think, is flawed.
Mr. Dasovich.
Yeah, there's a long history of public power in California, and I'm of the view that if people in their community or county or town want to municipalize, and it ought to be their right to vote and do it. They ought to do that. When we're talking about, again, I don't want us to fall into the trap that California tends to fall into, however, which is we don't care what the rest of the world or other states have done. We're California, so we're going to just not learn from any lessons. If you look at, it's not just deregulation hasn't only occurred in the United States, it's occurring across the globe. And countries like France, for example, where I spent some time, had a state-run, state-owned, state-financed system. You can find systems like that all across Europe and Asia and elsewhere across the world. Even those countries have deregulated and are privatizing, and it's working very, very well. So I would hope that before California, having seen the example of DWR's contracts, if California is going to plunge into the public power industry, I hope it takes a real hard look at what these other countries are doing first.
Mr. Weissman, last comment.
Well, Dr. Cicchetti has once again raised a point he made before about how LADWP and others may have charged high prices in the wholesale market. And in fact, that's been raised elsewhere. Lynn Kiesling raised it in a panel we had a little earlier in the afternoon. And I think that really raises this issue of accountability that I said was one of the lessons I've learned is important here. Because when you're talking about where LADWP is charging high prices and where it isn't, I'm much more interested in the prices they're charging to the customers they're accountable to, the ones who elected their representatives, because that's what municipal power is all about. What LADWP may or may not have done in the wholesale markets is no different from what any of the other parties acting in the wholesale market might have done. There aren't good suppliers and bad suppliers. They're just suppliers that are functioning within the rules and within the framework that's been created. It's kind of like, you remember Jessica Rabbit from Who Stole Roger Rabbit? I mean, she wasn't bad. She was just drawn that way. Well, that's kind of what parties are facing when they're functioning within this market. The question is, when you get outside, when you're in a municipal utility, you know who's accountable for the price of power, for reliability, for the quality of service, for planning for adequate supplies in the future. The question is, in the marketplace that we're functioning under or trying to function under in California right now, who's accountable to make sure the supply is adequate? Who's accountable to make sure that we have least cost power supplied? Who's accountable to make sure that there's a resource mix? We used to know those things, but when we started to put in place an independent system operator, a neutral power exchange, competitive markets, we lost a sense of where that accountability lies, and I think that's the number one problem that we're facing.
Well, it seems like California Energy is like the protagonist of Matthew Arnold's poem, Stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse, caught powerless between two worlds, one dead, the other yearning to be born. On this basis, I'd like to thank our panelists, to thank the Honorable Deborah Bowen, Senator Bowen, and to congratulate her on her tremendous work on behalf of this major crisis facing California. Professor Cicchetti, who's always clear-cut in his opinions and backs them up with a marvelous array of arithmetic and metaphor. Mr. Jeff Dasovich, who keeps saying that he's not a historian and then he draws very subtle and elegant historical conclusions. Mr. Fiedler, who makes me want to yearn for the days when everything was the way it used to be. Ever since I turned 60, I find that more and more, my point of view. And Professor Pratt for his marvelous historical side and his sense of the complexity of this and the comparative relationship of this problem to other states, other places, and to Mr. Larson for his wonderful discussion of long-term markets and also the question of national security. I think your comments were just very wonderful there, that it's something we're all facing together, and we have to sort of explore that. And to Mr. Weissman for making the Public Utilities Commission and its point of view seem intelligible to me, an ordinary voter. Well, this is envisioning the energy future of California, and I'd like to say that I also envision the energy future. I envision a California in the future in which people like myself will understand energy, and because of this panel, I'm a little closer to that. Thank you so much.
Dr. Starr, if I may indulge my highly regulated power as the Executive Director of the Center for Californian Studies to thank you for providing us with a wonderful moderating this panel, which was a wonderful conclusion of the conference. Thank all of you for coming, because after all, we wouldn't have a conference if it wasn't for you. And invite all of you to the reception, which is upstairs on the floor where all the panels were,